So how do we measure the voltage of a neuron? We have very thin glass micropipettes that we insert into the extracellular domain. We measure at point A, we baseline the micropipette, and then insert the micropipette into the cell membrane, into the body of the cell, and measure the voltage difference between the two. And here you see the time at which the electrode enters the neuron, and we baseline that at 0 millivolts, and then measure from the inside of the neuron, inside of the soma, and we note a difference of negative 70 millivolts from the outside to the inside. The beauty of this approach is that we can actually inject current to manipulate the membrane potential. This way we can mimic what happens during a local synaptic event, in that a depolarizing current is sent into the neuronal cell body, pretty much mimicking synaptic transmission at that area, and you watch as the membrane becomes more depolarized, more positive, and then positive ions will rush out of the membrane to complete the circuit. And let's be clear here, when we say depolarizing, we mean that the membrane has become more positive, such that here we started out with a minus 70 millivolts. We injected a positive current, bringing the membrane difference to about, that looks here, around 35 millivolts. So the difference between the two, the outside and inside, has become less negative. So let's look here at what's happening at a local event. Here you have an axon that's terminating on a dendrite here. You have this axon has obviously had some kind of action potential that allows neurochemicals, something to be released into the synaptic cleft that then depolarizes the dendrite right in this area, allowing positive current to flow into the cell at this area. So the current will move into the cell, but will then try to move back out to maintain that electrochemical equilibrium that we talked about earlier. So this current just kind of passively moves through the cell and comes back out to complete the circuit through here. But let's say then we have another axon terminal over here on this dendrite, at the same time creating an action potential that releases neurochemicals, creates a passive current here. You see these currents come out, but then the two join together. So what happens here is that at this point the membrane is even more depolarized, leading to what's known as an action potential. So an action potential is when you reach a certain threshold, we'll talk about in a few minutes, and you have sodium channels open up, sodium ions pour in, making this membrane significantly more positive, leading to a jump in the membrane potential. Now, in the area of the action potential, these are what we refer to as active currents because they're involved in an active process. They then move on to become, again, passive currents that continue to flow down, and if they have enough strength, generate another action potential. These passive currents are referred to as electrotonic conduction. Now, electrotonic currents, or otherwise known as passive currents, are decremental, meaning that they decrease over time. So what determines how far down the axon these currents will flow if they're not replenished by an active process like an action potential? First, the amplitude of the original current, how strong the original current was. Second is the resistance and capacitance of the membrane. The resistance means how resistant the membrane is to ions flowing back out of the membrane, thus decreasing the strength of the current. So it's the ability to hold that current inside the cell. The capacitance is the ability, as you know from batteries, the capacitance to hold a charge. Capacitors hold a charge. And third is the conductivity of the fluid in which the current's moving. And although I've referred to the currents, in this case, what you're seeing here as positive and depolarizing, you can also have negative currents. You can have hyperpolarization of the membrane, in which the membrane becomes the membrane potential becomes more negative, and thus decreasing the possibility of an action potential. I should be clear, though, that once this action potential starts, that there are sodium channels all down the length of this axon, and so once this action potential starts, it starts a series of action potentials that will continue down the axon until the action potential reaches the axon terminal. How fast those action potentials are propagated depends on a number of features, specifically having to do with the speed of the conduction velocity. So that you can envision that as the axonal diameter increases, then so does the concentration of sodium, voltage-gated sodium channels in the axon, and thus increasing the size of the axon diameter then would increase the speed of the conduction of the action potential. So let's move into the main event, the action potential. So let's talk about the major properties of action potentials. They convey information over long distances, and where at rest you see the cytosol having a negative charge relative to the extracellular space. Remember, we talked about the inside of the cell being about 70 millivolts more negative than the outside, giving a resting membrane potential of about negative 70 millivolts. This is actually reversed during an action potential when the inside of the cell becomes much more positive. Although small changes in the resting membrane potential convey information for short distances, and we saw that where these electrotonic currents just kind of petered out as they went down and dissipated, the action potential is large and regenerative. It continues on down the axon. The neural code is a function of the frequency and pattern of action potentials. In other words, the number and pattern of action potentials that it takes to convey meaningful information rather than their size. Action potentials are also called spikes, nerve impulses, or discharges. And they are caused, as you saw, by transient changes in membrane permeability to sodium and potassium ions. Here you see the phases of the action potential in milliseconds here. You have the resting potential, which, as we said, in most cases is about minus 70 millivolts. Action potential happens. You have the rising phase where the membrane potential becomes more positive, where it becomes equal inside and outside, where it overshoots and becomes more positive. In the overshoot phase, the falling phase is when the positive ions start to move out of the cell, moving back down, passing down past the resting membrane potential to the undershoot phase, where it becomes more negative than the resting potential, and then back to normal. And we had talked earlier about that you can inject current into the neuron to depolarize the neuron. If the depolarization is large enough to reach threshold, I'll talk about threshold in a second, it causes the production of action potentials. The number of action potentials are proportional to the size of the depolarization. So it's not that you get a larger action potential, you get more action potentials with a larger depolarization. So in other words, the all or none amplitude means that the amplitude of the action potential is independent of the current that you put in, such that you have a threshold here that you have to reach. If you don't reach the threshold, no action potential. If you reach the threshold, you get an action potential that again goes through those phases, comes down, hyperpolarizes, and then goes back to resting membrane. If you overshoot the threshold, you still get an action potential that goes up to the same ceiling and comes back down. And here we're just saying the same thing and showing different pictures, that the frequency of the action potentials is proportional to the amplitude of the depolarizing current. In other words, if you give a large current and it reaches threshold, you get more action potentials here. If you get a lesser current and it reaches threshold, you may get one action potential or a couple action potentials. So again, if the current does not depolarize the membrane, no action potential happens. A little bit, just reaching the threshold and action potential happens, goes to a certain amplitude. If you have a very big depolarization, you have same amplitude but more signal. And as you see on page 106 of your textbook, different types of neurons have very different firing patterns depending on the type of ion channel and the distribution of ion channels in those neurons. So that you have some neurons that will have rather steady firing rates, in response to a steady depolarizing current. There are other neurons that will have a quick burst of signal in the beginning and then slow down, again with the same amplitude, but slow down to a steady rate. And then you have neurons in which firing patterns will cluster. So these aren't great drawings, so do go to your book at page 106 and take a look at box 4.6 there. So in order to understand the action potential, we have to kind of go back and revisit what we'd already talked about when we said the membrane had reached an electrochemical equilibrium. So if you recall, the outside of the cell membrane was more positive relative to the inside, and that's because we have the sodium ions here that can't gain access to the intracellular domain because the membrane is relatively impermeable to sodium. You have potassium ions on the inside and the outside, which flow through the potassium channel towards the concentration gradient because there's less potassium out here, so it wants to increase the numbers of potassium ions on the extracellular domain. But when it does that, the inside becomes more negative because of these negatively charged proteins, so potassium then will flow back into the cell membrane. Adding to the electrochemical gradient, the electrical gradient, if you remember, is this structure called the sodium-potassium pump, which in the presence of ATP, which is transformed to ADP with a phosphate released and energy released, extrudes 3 sodium ions out of the cell and moves 2 potassium ions into the cell. So what you end up with is a cell whose inside of the cytosol is more negative than the outside of the cell. We also have, we talked about before, gated ion channels, which under certain circumstances will open up and allow for the transport of ions. In this case, this is a sodium gate. So how does this give us an action potential? Well, let's say that this gate here is a voltage-gated sodium channel. So that when the voltage, which starts at -70, reaches the threshold, these sodium gates open up. And what happens is, because we have a low concentration of sodium inside the cell and a higher concentration of sodium outside the cell, sodium floods into the cell towards the concentration gradient faster than potassium can rush out of the cell through those passive potassium channels. So you have a situation in which sodium is flooding into the cell. The inside of the cell is becoming positive, more positive relative to the outside of the cell, until the sodium causes the membrane potential to closely approximate the equilibrium potential for sodium, which means that the inside of the cell is actually becoming positive relative to the outside of the cell. At this point, two things happen. First, the sodium gates inactivate, meaning that sodium now can no longer enter the cell. Next, voltage-sensitive potassium channels, which we haven't really talked about yet, but haven't been major players until this point. At this point, those voltage-sensitive potassium channels actually open up, and potassium rushes out of the cell. What you start to see then is from this peak here, potassium starts rushing out of the cell, and the sodium gates inactivate, causing the cell to become increasingly negative on the inside relative to the outside. Because the voltage-gated or voltage-sensitive potassium channels are a little bit slow to close, you have this period where more potassium leaves the cell than normal, and you have a refractory period where the cell becomes hyperpolarized and cannot achieve another action potential. Additionally, it takes a bit of time for these inactivated sodium channels to become active again, for the sodium gates to become activated again. So you have this period of this absolute refractory period in which an action potential cannot be regenerated. The relative refractory period is that period in which it takes for the voltage-sensitive potassium channels to close. So you have an absolute refractory period where the sodium gates are inactivated and until they become active again, and then you have the relative refractory period where the potassium channels, the voltage-sensitive potassium channels, start to close and eventually become closed. During this falling phase or repolarization, you also have the sodium-potassium pump, which is extruding sodium from the cell and bringing potassium into the cell, which also contributes to the reestablishment of the resting membrane potential. As you can see here, the resting membrane potential is not a static thing. It's dynamic, with sodium being pumped out, potassium being pumped in. So let's take a look at concentrations. Over the cell membrane, you have 10 times more sodium outside of the cell than you do inside the cell. So sodium wants to come back in, but is unable to come back in with the concentration gradient because the membrane is impermeable to sodium. Potassium is 20 times higher inside the cell than it is out. Consequently, potassium wants to go outside the cell with the concentration gradient, but remember, it's being pulled back inside the cell because as it leaves, the cell becomes more negative. So it's caught between this fine balance here. Both chloride and calcium are higher outside the cell than they are inside the cell, although there are some intracellular compartments where calcium is higher. And it stands to reason that the membrane potential is pretty much dominated by that ion that has the greatest ability to move across the cell membrane. In this case, the resting membrane potential is dominated by potassium. However, all of these contribute to the resting membrane potential. So let's review. At point 1, the membrane is at its resting potential of about minus 70 millivolts. At point 2, following some sort of stimulus down here, the membrane reaches its threshold of about minus 45 millivolts, at which point the action potential is generated. At point 3, you see the upstroke, or what is also called depolarization. As sodium channels have opened up, sodium is rushing into the cell, and the cell is becoming more positive. At point 4, you have what's called an overshoot, as sodium continues to rush into the cell to reach its equilibrium potential. At this point, the overshoot, the sodium channels, the voltage-gated sodium channels close. At point 5 here, you have the downstroke or repolarization. This is where, now that the sodium channels have closed here, sodium is starting to be removed from the cell by the sodium-potassium pump. In addition, you have those voltage-sensitive potassium channels which are open at this point, and you have potassium leaving the cell towards the concentration gradient. So in this case, you have positive ions leaving the cell, and the cell is becoming increasingly negative. At point 6, the potassium channels are a bit slow to close, so you have potassium still leaving the cell, and the membrane actually becomes hyperpolarized. This is what we also call the undershoot phase. So at this point, the membrane can no longer be depolarized, and action potential cannot be generated at this point. We call this the refractory period. And because the sodium channels that have been inactivated here cannot be reactivated for a certain period of time, also contributing to this hyperpolarization, we call this the absolute refractory period, such that no action potential can be generated until those sodium channels are reactivated. So let's look at key features of the action potential. First, the action potential has a short duration, about 1 millisecond. Second, action potentials are generated in an all or nothing fashion. It either happens or it doesn't. You reach a threshold and bam, you have an action potential, or you just don't get there. Third, the intensity of the action potential is coded by frequency rather than amplitude. And remember, we said the stronger the stimulus, you don't see a stronger action potential, you just see more of them.